Hello, dear listener. Today, a very different story awaits you. The Curse of the Golden Goddess, the lost treasure, and the corpse in the locked room. This story will satisfy all your fatigue and need for mystery. Before we begin, if you enjoy stories like this, subscribe so you don't miss out on other stories. And most importantly, write in the comments what you want the next mystery to be. I read all comments carefully. Now, relax and unwind. Take a deep breath. The story begins. Chapter 1. Sherlock Holmes, we need you. On the 14th day of November, an unexpected sun rose over London. Sherlock Holmes, sitting by the fireplace, stared at the ceiling with a look of boredom on his face. Dr. John Watson, sitting at the breakfast table, enjoying the delicious eggs and bacon prepared by Mrs. Hudson, watched his friend's state with concern. Everyone who knew Holmes understood that the most dangerous moments for the great detective were when his mind was not occupied with a case. During such periods, Holmes would either immerse himself in his violin or spend hours conducting chemistry experiments. "Holmes," said Watson, setting down his fork, "the weather is truly magnificent this morning. Perhaps a walk would revive you. Hyde Park is quite beautiful at this time of year." Holmes turned his head and looked at his friend. That familiar sharpness flashed in his grey eyes for a moment, then faded again. "My dear Watson, the beauties of nature are undoubtedly admirable. But what I need right now is not sunshine or autumn leaves. What I need is a problem, a puzzle, a mystery waiting to be solved." Watson sighed. They had had this conversation many times before. "Didn't last week's jewel theft case satisfy you?" "That?" Holmes grumbled dismissively. "Watson, that case didn't require a detective, just anyone with eyes. The paint stain on the maid's left hand and the gardener's new expensive boots gave the culprits away in seconds. No, my friend, I'm looking for a real challenge, a case that will push my mind to its limits." Just then, footsteps on the stairs caught both their attention. The steps were quick and determined, like the herald of urgent news. Watson noticed the sudden sparkle in Holmes's eyes. Even before the door opened, the detective had sat up straight in his chair, regaining his usual liveliness. Mrs. Hudson opened the door and ushered Inspector Lestrade inside. Scotland Yard's senior inspector was, as always, neatly dressed and serious-looking, but his expression carried an unusual tension. His sharp-nosed face was pale, and his lips beneath his moustache were tightly pressed together. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," said Lestrade, tipping his hat in greeting. "I apologize for disturbing you at this early hour." Holmes was already on his feet. "Don't apologize, Lestrade. On the contrary, your timing is perfect. Watson was just suggesting we take a walk in Hyde Park to relieve my boredom. I see you offer a far more interesting alternative." Lestrade raised his eyebrows. "How do you know it's interesting?" Watson smiled. He always found Holmes's displays of this kind entertaining, and Lestrade's bewildered expression added a special flavour to them. "A simple observation," said Holmes, clasping his hands behind his back and beginning to pace the room. "First, you are here at this early hour before your normal working hours have begun. That indicates the matter is urgent. Second, there is a folded piece of paper in the right pocket of your coat, probably a telegram, which you read on the way here because the way it is folded makes that clear. Third, there is still dew on your left shoe, which suggests you came directly from the scene of the crime. Fourth, and most importantly, you have that familiar expression on your face, Lestrade, the one that only appears when you encounter cases that completely astonish and overwhelm you." Lestrade was momentarily at a loss for words, then took a deep breath. "You're right, Mr. Holmes. I'm coming from Ashford Manor. Sir Reginald Ashford was found dead this morning." Watson raised his eyebrows. "Sir Reginald Ashford? The famous collector?" "Himself," confirmed Lestrade. "And his death, Well, it occurred under unique circumstances. Holmes's eyes lit up. Go on, Lestrade. Don't disappoint me. The inspector took the telegram from his pocket and handed it to Holmes. Sir Reginald was found in his study. The door was locked from the inside and the only key was hanging on a chain around the victim's neck. The windows were also bolted from the inside. The fireplace is very narrow. Even a child couldn't fit through it. Watson whistled in amazement. A classic locked room case. As Holmes read the telegram, a slow smile spread across his face. Watson, take your coat. Your breakfast will unfortunately have to be cut short. Watson turned to his friend, that fire he hadn't seen in his eyes for a long time, burning brightly. At last, a real puzzle. 20 minutes later, Holmes, Watson, and Lestrade were riding in a hired horse-drawn carriage toward Hampstead Heath. The morning sun was still shining, but the air had turned cool. As Holmes looked out the window, Lestrade began to recount the case in more detail. Sir Reginald Ashford was 67 years old. In his youth, he had served in diplomatic posts in India and Egypt. He had devoted the last 20 years to collecting antiques. He was a respected figure in London society and a patron of several charities. His family? Asked Holmes, his eyes still fixed on the window. His second wife, Lady Vivian Ashford, is alive. He also has 3 children, Frederick and Charlotte from his first marriage, and William from his second. Watson had taken out his notebook. What happened to his first wife? Emily Ashford died of tuberculosis 15 years ago. Sir Reginald married Vivian Hartley 3 years later. Vivian was a 38-year-old widow at the time. Holmes finally turned away from the window. Who found the body? The butler, Mr. Harrington. At 7 o'clock this morning, he went to bring Sir Reginald his usual morning tea. Seeing the door locked, he waited at first, then grew concerned and woke the family. Frederick Ashford had the door broken down. How long has Harrington served the family? About 30 years, according to them. Holmes shook his head thoughtfully. Did Sir Reginald have any enemies? Business disputes? Personal animosities? Lestrade shrugged. We haven't had time to investigate thoroughly yet. However, competition in the antique world can be quite fierce. There are rumours that he had a tense encounter with a Russian collector at an auction a few months ago. Watson and Holmes exchanged glances. The Russian collector detail was interesting. As the car turned onto a tree-lined road at the edge of Hampstead Heath, Ashford Manor came into view. The 3-storey stone building, reflecting the grandeur of the Victorian era, rose in the middle of a large garden. Ivy climbed the front facade, and large windows reflected the morning sun. Everything looked extremely well kept and orderly. It was hard to believe that a tragedy had unfolded behind these walls. As the car's wheels crunched on the gravel path, the mansion's front door opened, and a tall, slender man stepped out. His face was pale and expressionless. His black clothes were immaculately pressed. This must be Mr. Harrington, the 30-year loyal servant. Inspector Lestrade, said Harrington, his voice emotionless but respectful. The family was expecting you. They are gathered in the great hall. As Holmes stepped out of the carriage, his eyes quickly scanned the surroundings. He examined the footprints on the gravel path, the doormat in front of the door, the flower pots at the base of the walls. Watson knew his friend was evaluating even this moment. Mr. Harrington, said Holmes, approaching the butler, were you the one who found the body? The old man bowed slightly. Yes, sir. This morning at 7 o'clock, I went to take my master his morning tea to his study. The door was locked. This was unusual because Sir Reginald usually got up early and left his door open. I knocked on the door but got no answer. I heard a wheezing sound inside, or at least I thought I did. Panicking, I woke up. Young Master Frederick. A rustling sound, Watson interjected. So Sir Reginald might have still been alive at that point? A flicker of pain crossed Harrington's face. I don't know, sir. Perhaps it was just my imagination. By the time the door was broken down, my master was already... Holmes nodded. Thank you, Harrington. I shall wish to speak with you in more detail later. The interior of the mansion was as impressive as the exterior. In the spacious entrance hall, a crystal chandelier hanging from the ceiling fragmented the morning light into 1,000 pieces. Oil portraits hung on the walls, likely from previous generations of the Ashford family. From the marble-floored hall, a wide staircase led up to the upper floors. Harrington directed them to the large salon on the right. When he opened the door, Watson saw the scene inside and held his breath for a moment. 4 people sat on the armchairs and sofas in the middle of the salon, each bearing the marks of grief and shock in their own way. Standing by the fireplace was a tall, silver-haired woman whom Watson guessed was Lady Vivian. Her face was pale, but her posture was upright, and there was a difficult-to-read expression in her ice-blue eyes. Sitting in the armchair next to her was a man in his 30s who resembled his father, but had a weaker jawline. Frederick Ashford's eyes were red, and his hands trembled slightly. However, Watson, with his experienced eye, could not tell if this trembling was due to grief or something else. Pulled up to the chair in front of the window, a dark-haired young woman was looking outside. Charlotte Ashford was strikingly beautiful in a melancholic way. She had inherited her mother's eyes, but there was a different depth, a sadness in them. Finally, there was a young man sitting in a chair in the corner. William Ashford, the youngest of the family, was 22 years old. His handsome face showed both anger and sorrow. He was clutching a book tightly on his lap, his fingers pressing so hard on the cover that his knuckles had turned white. Lady Vivian spoke first. "Inspector Lestrade," she said, her voice calm but cold. "Who are the gentlemen you have brought with you?" Lestrade stepped forward. "Lady Ashford, allow me to introduce Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson. Mr. Holmes is London's most respected consulting detective. I believe his assistance will be invaluable in this case." Lady Vivian's eyebrows rose slightly. "Sherlock Holmes? The detective I've read about in the newspapers?" Holmes bowed slightly. "I advise you to believe half of what the newspapers write, Lady Ashford. Dr. Watson's passion for his pen can sometimes lead to exaggeration." Watson cleared his throat slightly but made no comment. Frederick Ashford stood up, an impatient expression on his face. "Mr. Holmes, I hope you can solve this tragedy quickly. My father's death in this manner is unacceptable." "My condolences," said Holmes, looking first at Lady Vivian, then at the other family members. "I apologize for having to disturb you with my questions after such a loss. However, I hope you understand that time is of the essence." Charlotte Ashford turned from the window. Her voice was soft but clear. "Mr. Holmes, whoever killed my father must be found. We are prepared to do whatever is necessary." William grumbled from his corner but said nothing. Holmes noted the young man's reaction. "First," said Holmes, "I wish to see the study. Has Lestrade sealed the room?" "Yes, Mr. Holmes, we've been expecting you." "Excellent." Holmes headed for the door, then paused and turned back. "One more question. When did Sir Reginald retire to his study last night? And who was the last person to see him?" The family members looked at each other. Lady Vivian answered, "After dinner, around 9 o'clock. He said he wanted to examine an antique he had recently purchased. He wished us all good night and went upstairs." "And what was this antique?" This time Frederick answered, "A papyrus from Egypt. My father had bought it at an auction last week. He was very excited. He thought it was from the time of an ancient pharaoh." Holmes's eyes lit up for a moment. "I see. Thank you." He turned to Lestrade and Watson. "Let's go to the study." As they climbed the stairs, Watson noticed his friend's thoughtful expression. "What are you thinking, Holmes?" Holmes whispered his reply. It's too early to think, Watson. But I can say this. This family has much more complex relationships than meets the eye. Lady Vivian's coolness, Frederick's tension, Charlotte's aloofness, and William's suppressed anger. Each of them has a story to tell. On the second floor, at the end of a long corridor, they came to the door of Sir Reginald's study. The door frame was broken, the door itself half torn off its hinges. A police officer stood guard in front of the door. Holmes examined the door frame as he removed his gloves. "Quality oak," he murmured. "Breaking this door must have required considerable force." "Frederick and 2 servants broke it together," said Lestrade. Holmes nodded and entered the room. Watson followed him and paused for a moment. The study was larger and more impressive than Watson had imagined. Bookshelves lining the walls were filled with thousands of volumes. In one corner stood a small fireplace. In the other, a massive desk. On the desk, papers, magnifying glasses, old parchments, and various antique objects were scattered about. On the opposite wall was a single large window, its heavy velvet curtains left half open. And in the middle of the room, in a large leather armchair, sat the lifeless body of Sir Reginald Ashford. Watson immediately approached the body, guided by his medical instincts. The old man sat in the chair as if asleep. His white hair was neatly combed, his eyes closed. There was no expression of pain or fear on his face. On the contrary, he looked almost peaceful. However, the colour of his skin and the stiffness of his muscles clearly indicated that death had come hours ago. "Interesting," Watson murmured as he carefully examined the body. "No visible wound from the outside. No signs of strangulation either." Holmes did not reply. He was slowly pacing around the room, examining everything carefully. First he went to the window. He checked the latch. It was securely locked from the inside. There were no signs of forced entry on the window frame. Then he bent over the fireplace, stuck his head inside, and looked up. "The fireplace is too narrow," he said, his voice echoing in the chimney. "Even a child couldn't fit through. Also, there's no soot inside, so no one has passed through here." Then he turned to the door. He examined the broken frame and the lock mechanism. "Watson, look here." Watson approached. Holmes was pointing to the inside of the lock. This lock was turned from the inside, not with a key, but by hand. And look, the bolt has been thrown. So Sir Reginald locked himself in. It appears so. Holmes took his magnifying glass from his pocket and began examining the door threshold. He worked silently for a while, then stood up. "Now let's examine the body." They looked at the chain around Sir Reginald's neck. The chain looked simple but sturdy, and a single key hung from it. Holmes examined the key carefully. "This key," he said, "does not belong to the door of this room." Lestrade was surprised. "What do you mean?" Holmes held up the key. "This key is very small and of a different workmanship, probably a safe or drawer key." He scanned the room with his eyes. "Is there a safe here?" Lestrade shook his head. "I asked Harrington. He said there was no safe in the study." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Interesting." He turned to the body and looked carefully between the lips. "Watson, do you have your instruments with you?" Watson took a small spatula out of his bag. Holmes opened the old man's mouth and looked inside. "Look, Watson, a slight discoloration of the tongue and this smell." Watson leaned over and sniffed. His eyes widened. "Bitter almonds?" "Yes, but it's not cyanide. The smell is similar but different, sweeter, more exotic." Holmes straightened up, a thoughtful expression on his face. "I've encountered this smell somewhere before, in a case related to India." Watson looked worried. "Are you saying poisoning?" "Absolutely, and not just any poison. Something rare, probably plant-based, specific to the Indian subcontinent." Lestrade had taken out his notebook. So someone poisoned Sir Reginald. But how? In a locked room? Holmes smiled, but his eyes didn't. That, Lestrade, is the question that needs answering. But for now, I'm curious about something else. He walked to the table and began shuffling the papers. Where is the papyrus from Egypt? The three of them searched the room together. They checked the bookcases, drawers, every corner of the desk. The papyrus was nowhere to be found. "It's missing," Holmes said finally, his voice tinged with both disappointment and excitement. Someone didn't just kill Sir Reginald, they also stole his most valuable possession. Watson looked at the window. "But that's impossible. The room is locked from the inside, the windows are barred, and you can't get through the fireplace. How could the papyrus have disappeared?" Holmes's eyes lit up. "That's why, Watson, this case is no ordinary murder. This is a crime that was thought out, planned, and executed with skill. And He paused, a slight smile appearing on his lips. "I'm looking forward to solving this puzzle." He looked out the window. In the garden, a gardener was raking leaves, a maid was hanging laundry. A normal day, normal activities. But within these walls, a dark secret was hidden. "Lestrade," said Holmes, turning, "I wish to speak with the family members separately. I will also need a list of all the staff and Sir Reginald's correspondence from the last few months." "I'll arrange it immediately." Holmes looked at the body again. The old man's peaceful face contrasted with the circumstances of his death. "Sir Reginald," he murmured to himself, "you tried to take your secrets to the grave, but don't worry, I'm quite persistent when it comes to finding them." Watson knew his friend well. The hunt had begun, and once Sherlock Holmes picked up a trail, nothing could stop him. As he left the room, Watson glanced back one last time. The dead man was still sitting there like a silent witness guarding his secrets. But Watson knew that silence would not last long. Holmes had a unique talent for making the dead talk. And this case, by all indications, would be one of the most interesting cases Holmes had ever encountered. Chapter 2. The Secrets of the Dead Men. The afternoon sun was beginning to fade in the great hall of Ashford Manor. The light streaming through the windows cast a golden glow on the family portraits on the walls. Holmes sat in the armchair by the fireplace, his fingers interlaced as he pondered. Watson, meanwhile, had placed his notebook on his lap, ready to record his friend's inquiries. First, Lady Vivian Ashford entered. Her silver hair was perfectly coiffed, and her black morning dress emphasized her elegance. Her ice-blue eyes scanned Holmes, her face wearing an expression that was difficult to read. It was as if this woman had dedicated her life to hiding her emotions. "Mr. Holmes," said Lady Vivian, sitting down in the chair opposite him, "I hope this meeting won't take long. It's already been a difficult day for my family." Holmes bowed his head slightly. "Of course, Lady Ashford. I just have a few questions. What did you do after 9 o'clock last night?" Lady Vivian's face remained impassive. "After dinner, I went to the drawing room. I spoke with Charlotte for a while, then retired to my room. I did not leave my room during the night." "What did you speak with Charlotte about?" "Nothing specific. An upcoming society event, that sort of thing." Watson took notes. Holmes continued. "What was your relationship with your husband like, Lady Ashford?" Something flashed in the woman's eyes for a moment, then vanished. "Reginald was a good husband. He always treated me with respect during our 15 years of marriage." "Love or respect?" Lady Vivian's lips tightened slightly. "Mr. Holmes, in our generation, marriage is based on mutual respect and harmony rather than romantic feelings. I loved Reginald, yes. But it wasn't the kind of love young girls read about in novels." Holmes nodded. "Did you notice Sir Reginald seemed anxious or troubled in recent days?" Lady Vivian paused for a moment. "Actually, yes. He had been a bit distracted for the past few weeks. After he bought that papyrus, he became even more withdrawn. He would spend hours in his study and come down for meals late. Did he tell you anything about the papyrus? Only that it was very valuable and important. He thought he had made a historical discovery. He didn't share the details, and I'm not really interested in antiques anyway. Holmes stood up and walked to the window. One last question, Lady Ashford. Did your husband have any enemies? Anyone who threatened him, who wanted to harm him? A shadow crossed Lady Vivian's face. The world of antiques is a competitive place, Mr. Holmes. Reginald had rivals, of course, but enemies? I don't know. A few months ago, he had a tense encounter with a Russian collector at an auction. The man was quite angry when he lost. Do you know his name? Zaroff. Victor Zaroff. Holmes and Watson exchanged glances. That name had come up before with Lestrade. Lady Vivian stood up. If there's nothing else, Mr. Holmes, I need to attend to my family. Holmes bowed. Thank you, Lady Ashford. That's all for now. After the woman left, Watson looked at his notebook. What do you think, Holmes? Holmes gazed out the window at the garden. Lady Vivian is a very controlled woman, Watson. Perhaps too controlled. Her husband was found dead this morning, yet she didn't shed a tear, nor did her voice even tremble. Either she possesses extraordinary self-discipline, or she wasn't particularly affected by her husband's death. Is she a suspect? Everyone is a suspect, Watson, for now. The door opened again, and Frederick Ashford entered. The man, who resembled his father but had weaker features, still carried the tension of the morning. His hands trembled slightly, and he had dark circles under his eyes. Mr. Holmes, said Frederick, his voice a little hushed, I don't want to keep you waiting too long. I want you to find my father's killer. Holmes carefully examined Frederick's hands. The trembling seemed to be more than just nervousness. Could it be withdrawal symptoms? Mr. Ashford, where were you last night? Frederick slumped into a chair. After dinner, I went to the billiard room. I played alone for a while, then went up to my room. What time? Around 11, I think. I don't remember exactly. Was anyone else in the billiard room? Frederick shook his head. No, I was alone. Holmes pressed his fingertips together. What was your relationship with your father like, Mr. Ashford? A shadow passed over Frederick's face. My father was a difficult man. He expected a lot from me, and I couldn't always meet his expectations. What kind of expectations? He wanted me to be successful in business, to make a name for the family, to be like him. Frederick laughed bitterly. But I'm not my father. I never could be. Watson noted the pain in the young man's words. There were deep wounds here, disappointments accumulated over the years. Holmes got straight to the point. Mr. Ashford, let's talk about your gambling debts. Frederick's face turned pale. What? How do you know? Your hands are trembling. You haven't had breakfast this morning because the tension in your stomach is preventing you from eating. The circles under your eyes are not from lack of sleep, but from anxiety. And most importantly, the ink stain on the index finger of your right hand bears the traces of many hastily written letters, probably begging letters to your creditors. Frederick buried his head in his hands. Yes, I have debts. I have many debts. If my father knew, he would disown me. How much do you owe? Frederick's voice dropped to a whisper. £5,000. Watson whistled. That was more than a worker's 10 years' wages. Holmes remained calm. And how will your father's death affect these debts? Frederick raised his head, his eyes showing both fear and a glimmer of hope. The inheritance might cover part of it. But I swear, Mr. Holmes, I didn't kill my father. I couldn't have killed him. Do you know about the will? No, the solicitor will read it officially tomorrow. Holmes stood up. Thank you, Mr. Ashford. That's all for now. Frederick paused as he walked to the door. "Mr. Holmes, one more thing. I heard my father mention a name frequently in his last days. Mercer. Captain Mercer. Does that name mean anything to you?" Holmes's eyes lit up. "Not yet, but it will." After Frederick left, Holmes quickly turned to Watson. "Make a note, Watson. Captain Mercer. We need to look into that name." The third meeting was with Charlotte Ashford. When the young woman entered the room, Watson noticed she looked even paler than she had that morning. Her dark hair fell to her shoulders, and a storm was hidden in those deep eyes she had inherited from her mother. When Charlotte sat down opposite Holmes, her hands were clasped in her lap. Her fingers were wrapped so tightly around each other that her knuckles had turned white. "Miss Ashford," Holmes said softly, "I apologize for disturbing you at this difficult time." Charlotte nodded slightly. "It's all right, Mr. Holmes. I want to find my father's killer. Whatever it takes. Where were you last night?" "After dinner, my stepmother and I sat in the living room. We talked for about an hour, then I went up to my room. I tried to sleep all night, but I didn't have much success." "You couldn't sleep? Why?" Charlotte hesitated for a moment. "Lately, my mind has been preoccupied. Personal matters." Holmes pressed gently. "What kind of personal matters, Miss Ashford?" The young woman's eyes filled with tears, but she held them back. "It's not related to your case, Mr. Holmes. Miss Ashford, I decide what is and isn't related to a murder investigation. Please." Charlotte took a deep breath. "I was seeing someone my father wouldn't approve of. An artist, a painter. My father would be furious if he found out." "What is this painter's name?" Daniel Crawford. But he couldn't have done this, Mr. Holmes. Daniel wouldn't hurt a fly." Holmes shook his head. "Did your father know about this relationship?" A shadow crossed Charlotte's face. "I don't know. Sometimes he looked at me strangely, as if he knew something, but he never asked. And if he had found out, he would have disowned me. He would have cut me off. My father was very strict about the family's reputation." Watson wrote in his notebook, "Charlotte, secret relationship, inheritance threat." Holmes asked one last question. "Miss Ashford, did your father ever say anything to you about that papyrus?" Charlotte frowned. "Papyrus? No, my father rarely discussed his collection with me, but once, last week, he said something very strange." "What was it?" "He said, 'Charlotte, sometimes the past finds you. You can't escape it.' I didn't understand what he meant then. I still don't." Holmes's eyes narrowed. That sentence was important. Very important. After Charlotte left, the last family member remaining was William Ashford. When the young man entered the room, Holmes immediately noticed the change in him. The suppressed anger of the morning had given way to a cold detachment. The 22-year-old looked older than his age, but this maturity seemed to come from painful experiences. William sat down in the opposite chair without saying a word and looked at Holmes. There was defiance in his eyes. "Mr. Ashford," said Holmes, "I see that, as the youngest member of your family, you feel somewhat isolated in this house." William's eyebrows rose. "Where did that come from?" "From your posture, your gaze, your sitting in a corner separate from the other family members this morning. And from the book in your hand. The work of the Russian thinker Kropotkin, if I'm not mistaken. You're interested in anarchist ideas." A smile appeared on William's face, but it was not a warm smile. "Impressionistic detective work. The newspapers weren't wrong." "Where were you last night?" "In my room, reading." "Did anyone see you?" "No, I prefer solitude." Holmes asked directly. "How was your relationship with your father?" William's face hardened. "My father was a representative of the capitalist system, the heir to a fortune built on exploitation. Our ideas didn't align." Does that mean you didn't love him? William thought for a moment. I loved my father, Mr. Holmes. Not his ideas. He was a product of the old world. I dream of a new world. But that didn't require me to kill him. Watson interjected. What do you mean by a new world? William turned to Watson. Equality, Dr. Watson. True equality. A world without aristocracy, wealth, or classes. The end of everything my father represented. Holmes pressed his fingertips together. Interesting ideas, but for now, I need to ask a more practical question. What do you know about your father's papyrus? William shrugged. An old piece of paper. My father's latest obsession. He hasn't talked about anything else since it arrived last week, as if that papyrus were the most important thing in the world. Have you seen it? Once. It was on his desk when I broke into his study. It had strange symbols on it. Hieroglyphics, I think. My father got very angry when he saw me and threw me out of the room. Holmes leaned forward with interest. When was that? 3 days ago. And have you seen the papyrus since then? No, my father started keeping his study locked. Holmes stood up. Thank you, Mr. Ashford. That was very enlightening. William also stood up, but paused before walking to the door. Mr. Holmes, may I say something? Of course. Every member of this family has a secret, myself included. But whose secret is dark enough to kill my father? That's what you must discover. After the young man left, Holmes and Watson remained silent for a while. The fire crackled in the hearth, and outside, the sun was beginning to set. Watson closed his notebook. 4 family members, 4 potential motives. Lady Vivian's coldness, Frederick's debts, Charlotte's forbidden love, William's radical ideas. So what do we do now? Holmes took his watch out of his pocket. We need to talk to the staff, especially Mr. Harrington. A butler of 30 years, he must know all the family's secrets. They found Harrington in the kitchen, where the old butler was giving instructions to the maids. Seeing Holmes, he immediately came over. Mr. Holmes, how can I help you? Holmes pulled him aside. Harrington, I want to talk to you about Sir Reginald. You've served this family for 30 years. You must know him better than anyone. A pained expression appeared on the old man's face. Yes, sir. Sir Reginald was not just an employer to me. He was like a friend. Have you noticed any changes in him lately? Harrington nodded thoughtfully. Yes, sir. After that papyrus arrived, Sir Reginald changed. He became more withdrawn, more anxious. He would stay in his study late into the night. Sometimes I would still see light under his door in the early hours of the morning. Was he afraid of something? Afraid, perhaps, but more like guilt, as if a ghost from the past had come to visit him. Holmes's eyes lit up. From the past? What do you mean? Harrington lowered his voice. Sir, during Sir Reginald's days in India, certain things happened. I never learned the details, but sometimes, especially on nights when he had been drinking, he would let it slip. Mercer's revenge, he would murmur, and the Golden Goddess. Watson eagerly took notes. The name Mercer had come up again. Holmes asked, Who is Captain Mercer, Harrington? The old butler shook his head. I don't know, sir. But whenever Sir Reginald mentioned that name, his voice would tremble, as if he were talking about a ghost. Well, did you notice anything that night? An unusual sound, a movement? Harrington thought for a moment. Actually, around 11 o'clock, while looking out the window, I saw a light in the garden, like a lantern. It was moving among the trees, but then it disappeared. I thought it was probably the night watchman. Do you have a night watchman? No, sir. Actually, no. Holmes and Watson exchanged glances. This was an important clue. Holmes asked one last question. Was there a safe in Sir Reginald's study, or a secret drawer? Harrington looked surprised. A safe? Not that I know of, sir, but... He hesitated. But... The bookcases in the study are very old. They date back to the mansion itself. Rumour has it that they had secret compartments in the old owner's time, but I've never seen them. Holmes smiled. Thank you, Harrington. You've been very helpful. On the way back, Watson couldn't hide his excitement. Secret compartments, Holmes. Perhaps the secret of the locked room lies there. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. Perhaps, Watson, perhaps. But first, let's hear from the other staff. Mrs. Whitmore, the mansion's housekeeper, was a serious-looking woman in her 50s. Her grey hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and she wore a black dress. Holmes kept it brief. Mrs. Whitmore, what was your relationship with Sir Reginald? A strange expression flashed across the woman's face for a moment. It was professional, sir. I was responsible for the running of this house, and Sir Reginald was my employer. Nothing else? Mrs. Whitmore's cheeks flushed slightly. I don't understand what you mean, sir. Holmes did not press her, but Watson noted the woman's reaction. There was something here. The interview with the young valet, George, was shorter. The 25-year-old young man clearly came from one of London's poor neighbourhoods. His nervous gaze and quick movements bore the traces of a troubled past. George, said Holmes, when did you come to this house? 2 years ago, sir. Mr. Harrington hired me. What was your previous job? George's face tensed. Various jobs, sir. Dock work, porterage, that sort of thing. Holmes's eyes studied the young man's hands. And theft. George's face turned pale. I left that life behind, sir. I swear. Calm down, George. I'm not accusing you. I just want to know your past. George swallowed. Yes, sir, in my youth. I made mistakes. But Mr. Harrington gave me a chance. I've been working honestly for the last 2 years. Holmes nodded. Where were you last night? In the servants' quarters, sir. With the other staff. We went to bed at 10. Did you hear anything during the night? George thought for a moment. Actually, around midnight, I heard a door creak, but I was very sleepy, so I didn't pay attention. Which direction did it come from? From the back stairs, I think. The stairs the servants use. Holmes committed this information to memory. Could the back stairs be another way to the study? Finally, they spoke to the young maid, Elsie. The 19-year-old redhead trembled as she answered their questions. Elsie, Watson said gently, don't be afraid. We just want to ask if you saw anything last night. Elsie's eyes widened. She seemed to want to say something, but was afraid. Holmes noticed. Elsie, if you saw something, you must tell us. You could help us find Sir Reginald's killer. The young girl swallowed. If I say something, will I get into trouble? No, Elsie, I promise. Elsie took a deep breath. Last night, around 11 o'clock, I passed by the study door. I heard voices inside. Holmes leaned forward. What kind of voices? Voices, sir. Sir Reginald and someone else. They were arguing. What were they saying? Elsie shook her head. I couldn't hear clearly, sir. But Sir Reginald's voice was very angry. He said, You can't do that. And then the other voice said, It's too late. Watson quickly jotted it down in his notebook. This was a crucial statement. Holmes asked, Did you recognize that other voice, Elsie? Was it one of the family members? Elsie's face paled. I don't know, sir. The voice, it was muffled, as if someone was trying to disguise it. Was it a man or a woman? I can't be sure. I really can't be sure. Holmes stood up. Thank you, Elsie. You were very brave. After the young girl left, Holmes and Watson looked at each other. Night had long since fallen outside. The fire in the fireplace was dying down. Watson closed his notebook. Elsie's statement changes everything, Holmes. Sir Reginald was not alone that night. Holmes walked to the window and looked out into the darkness. Yes, Watson, and that mysterious visitor was probably our murderer. But who? Someone from the family? Someone from outside? The lantern light in the garden? Yes, I'm thinking about that too. Someone entered this mansion that night. But how? And how did they get the papyrus? Watson remembered something. The key around his neck. You said it didn't belong to the room's door. Holmes turned, his eyes shining. You're right, Watson. That key belongs somewhere, and tomorrow we'll find that place. But now, even as he yawned, his mind continued to work. Now we must return to Baker Street and think. There are missing pieces in this puzzle. Too many missing pieces. As they left the mansion, Watson noticed a shadow moving in one of the dark windows behind them. Someone was watching them. He couldn't see who it was, but he felt a chill. Everyone in this house had a secret, and one of those secrets had led to the death of Sir Reginald Ashford. Chapter 3. Traces of the Past. The next morning, the sun was shining again on Baker Street, but Holmes's mind was already wandering through dark corridors. When Watson came downstairs, he found his friend in the armchair by the fireplace. Smoke from his pipe rose in lazy rings through the room. Scattered papers, maps and telegram forms lay on the table. "Did you sleep last night, Holmes?" Watson asked as he sat down at the breakfast table. Holmes replied without looking up. "Sleep, Watson, is a waste of time, at least when the mind is so occupied." He picked up a piece of paper. "I sent several telegrams last night. The replies are starting to come in." Watson approached curiously. "What did you find?" Holmes stood up and walked to the window. "Captain Jonathan Mercer, a sailor who served with the East India Company in 1872. He transported antiques and valuables from Bombay to London, and guess who his partner was at the time? Sir Reginald Ashford." "Spot on." Holmes turned, that familiar gleam in his eyes. But the story doesn't end there. In 1875, Mercer's ship sank in the Indian Ocean. The entire crew was lost. Official records say a storm, but some rumours suggest otherwise. Watson furrowed his brow. What kind of rumours? Holmes picked up another piece of paper from the table. An old newspaper clipping. The Times of India, dated 1875. It claims Mercer's ship was carrying valuable cargo, ancient Egyptian artifacts, specifically a gold statue stolen from a temple, known as the Golden Goddess. Watson blinked. The Golden Goddess Harrington mentioned. "Yes, Watson, the same one. And that statue was sunk to the bottom of the ocean with that ship. At least that's what everyone thought." Mrs. Hudson entered, holding an envelope. "Mr. Holmes, a messenger just arrived from the British Museum." Holmes eagerly opened the envelope. A smile appeared on his face as he read. "Excellent. Professor Webb will see us today. Watson, get our coats. We're off to Bloomsbury." The British Museum's massive columns looked imposing even in the November sun. As Holmes and Watson climbed the marble stairs, Watson couldn't help but think about the thousands of years of history contained within this building. Treasures from pharaohs' tombs, remains of Greek temples, the last traces of lost civilizations. All of them lay silently within these walls. The Egyptian Antiquities Department was located in the east wing of the museum. As they walked down the long corridors, mummies, papyri, and hieroglyphic tablets lined the glass display cases on both sides. Finally, they reached a door marked Professor M. Webb, Curator. Holmes knocked on the door, and a muffled voice from inside said, "Come in." The office was one of the most cluttered places Watson had ever seen. Books, parchments, ancient objects, and notes were piled up on every surface. Behind the desk sat a bespectacled man in his 60s. With his dishevelled white hair and dirty lab coat, he looked like a typical academic. Professor Marcus Webb stood up when he saw his guests. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson." He extended his hand, his palm covered in ink and dust. "I received your letter. I heard about Sir Reginald's death, a terrible tragedy. I helped him purchase the papyrus, you know. Holmes got straight to the point. Professor, what can you tell us about that papyrus? Webb adjusted his glasses and took a deep breath. Ah, that papyrus. An extraordinary piece, Mr. Holmes. Truly extraordinary. He pulled a file from among the papers on his desk. Ptolemaic period, around 200 BC, but its content refers to something much older, to the New Kingdom period. Watson asked curiously, "What kind of content?" Webb's eyes lit up. "A map, Dr. Watson. A map showing the way to a lost pharaoh's treasure, to the secret tomb of Amenhotep III." Holmes raised his eyebrows. "Amenhotep III? Isn't he Tutankhamun's grandfather?" "His great-grandfather, yes. And according to ancient sources, Amenhotep III was the wealthiest ruler of his era. His official tomb was found in the Valley of the Kings, but it was empty. For centuries, researchers have believed the real tomb lies elsewhere." Watson whistled. "And this papyrus shows the location of that tomb?" Webb nodded. "It seems so. Of course, we can't be sure until the papyrus is fully deciphered. The hieroglyphs are complex, and some sections are damaged. But Sir Reginald said he was very close to solving it." Holmes thoughtfully touched his finger to his lip. "Professor, how valuable is this papyrus?" Webb smiled, but it wasn't a cheerful smile. "It's priceless, Mr. Holmes. If the map is real and the treasure is found, it would be the greatest archaeological discovery in the world. Museums, collectors, even governments would pay a fortune for it." "And Sir Reginald acquired it at an auction?" "Yes, in Paris 3 weeks ago. It was a small auction house, and most collectors didn't understand the papyrus's importance. Sir Reginald was lucky, or prepared. His only serious rival was a Russian collector." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Victor Zaroff." Webb looked surprised. "You know him?" "The name has come up a few times. What can you tell us about him?" Professor Webb looked uncomfortable. "Zaroff is a dangerous man, Mr. Holmes. Rich, ruthless, and will stop at nothing to get what he wants. His collection is one of the largest in the world, but his acquisition methods are not always legal." "What do you mean?" Webb lowered his voice. "There are rumors. They say he threatens sellers, eliminates competitors. In fact, a few years ago, an antique dealer was murdered in Vienna, and Zaroff's name came up, but nothing could be proven." Watson wrote in his notebook, "Zaroff was a dangerous suspect." Holmes moved on to another subject. "Professor, have you heard of something called the Golden Goddess?" Webb's face changed. Watson couldn't tell if it was fear or excitement in his eyes. "The Golden Goddess? Where did you hear about it?" "It came up while researching Sir Reginald's past." Webb stood up and walked to the window. He looked outside for a moment, then turned back. "The Golden Goddess is the sacred statue of Hathor, one of ancient Egypt's most valuable artifacts. It was stolen from a temple near Luxor in 1874. The thieves were never caught, and the statue was never seen again. It's said to have gone down with Captain Mercer's ship in 1875. Webb shook his head. "Yes, there are rumours, but some people think differently." "What do they think?" Webb hesitated. "Some believe the statue never boarded the ship, that it was brought ashore before it sank, and that it's still hidden somewhere." Holmes's eyes lit up. "Interesting. Very interesting," Watson interjected. "But what does this have to do with the papyrus?" Holmes replied. "Perhaps it has everything to do with it, Watson. Sir Reginald was Captain Mercer's partner. They traded in antiquities together. And now, years later, another valuable artifact related to Egypt comes into Sir Reginald's possession." "Coincidence?" Professor Webb interjected. "Mr. Holmes, I must tell you something else. Sir Reginald came to me after he got the papyrus. He asked for help with deciphering it. We worked together and we discovered something." "What was it?" "There was a note on the papyrus, added later, written in a different hand. Not hieroglyphics, Greek. It said, "The goddess holds the key." Watson frowned. "What does that mean?" Webb shrugged. "I don't know." Neither did Sir Reginald, but he was very excited. It was as if he understood something. Holmes suddenly stood up. "Professor, thank you. You've given us some very valuable information." Webb extended his hand. "Sir Reginald was a good man, Mr. Holmes. Find his killer." As they left the museum, Watson studied his friend's thoughtful face. "What are you thinking, Holmes? What does the goddess holds the key mean?" Holmes paused for a moment in the street. "Think, Watson. Sir Reginald had a key around his neck, a key that didn't belong to the room's door. And now the phrase, 'the goddess holds the key.' There's a connection, I can feel it, even if I can't see it. The golden goddess? Perhaps, or maybe another goddess." Holmes hailed a horse-drawn carriage on the street. "Now we have questions to ask someone else. Captain Mercer's family." Watson was surprised. Mercer's family? But the man died 20 years ago. Holmes smiled as he got into the carriage. "He died, Watson, yes. But he left behind a son, and that son is in London right now." The horse-drawn carriage headed eastward through London. As we moved away from the wealthy west side of the city, the buildings grew older and the streets narrower. Watson caught the distinctive smell of the Limehouse district as he looked out the window. Salt, fish, and something decaying. "This is a dangerous area, Holmes," said Watson, his hand moving to the pistol under his coat. Holmes shook his head. "Dangerous, but rich in information. London's dark side always holds the best secrets." The car stopped at the beginning of a narrow street. A rusty sign swayed in front of them. "Mercer and Son, Import-Export." Two men, armed, stood in front of the building. Holmes approached without hesitation. "I want to see Captain Jonathan Mercer's son." One of the men, a big guy with a scar on his face, looked at him with contempt. "Who are you looking for?" "Sherlock Holmes, and tell him I want to talk to him about Sir Reginald Ashford." The man's expression changed. After a moment's hesitation, he went inside. A few minutes later, he returned and opened the door. "Mr. Mercer is expecting you." The interior was cleaner and more orderly than it appeared from the outside. A narrow corridor led to a spacious office. And in the middle of the office, behind a massive desk, sat a one-eyed man. Captain Jonathan Mercer's son was the spitting image of his father. He was about 45 years old, with bronze skin and harsh facial features. A black eye patch covered his left eye, but his right eye was watching Holmes with keen attention. "Mr. Holmes," said the man, his voice deep and husky, "we finally meet. I am James Mercer." Holmes sat down opposite him. Watson remained standing near the door. "Mr. Mercer, I don't know your father, but I know his story, and I think there may be a connection with the death of Sir Reginald Ashford." A smile appeared on James Mercer's face, but his eyes did not smile. "Sir Reginald is dead? How unfortunate. Weren't you aware?" "I heard, the newspapers wrote about it," Holmes asked directly. "Did you kill Sir Reginald?" Mercer laughed, this time a genuine laugh. "A straightforward man. I appreciate that." "No, Mr. Holmes, I didn't kill him, but I won't lie either. I'm not sorry he's dead." "Why?" Mercer's face hardened. "Because Sir Reginald Ashford was my father's killer." Watson held his breath. Holmes remained calm. "Continue." Mercer took a bottle of whiskey from the table and poured 3 glasses. He handed one to Holmes and one to Watson. 1875. My father was in business with Sir Reginald. They were bringing antiques from India. Big money was involved. The Golden Goddess. Mercer's eyes lit up. "So you know the statue?" "Yes, my father found it. in a temple. Let's say he rescued it. The plan was, he would bring the statue to London, Sir Reginald would arrange the sale, and they would split the profits. But things didn't go as planned. No. Mercer downed his whiskey in one gulp. The ship sank. The entire crew died, including my father. Official records say it was a storm. Holmes asked, "Do you think differently?" Mercer leaned forward. "Mr. Holmes, the night before that ship sank, Sir Reginald disembarked. Urgent business," he said, with a crate, and the next day the ship sank. Watson understood. Sir Reginald stole the statue and the ship. Sank it? I can't prove it. But my father died, and Sir Reginald returned to London a wealthy man. What do you think? Holmes thoughtfully swirled the whiskey in his glass. And you waited 20 years for revenge? Mercer shook his head. I didn't seek revenge, Mr. Holmes. I accepted my father's death. I built my own life, but... He paused. But? A few weeks ago I received a letter. Unsigned. It contained only an address and a date. The address and date of the auction in Paris. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Someone informed you that the papyrus was going to be sold. Yes. And there was a note at the bottom of the letter. Your last chance for your father's revenge. Watson asked, Did you go to the auction? No, I don't get involved in those games, but I kept the letter. Mercer opened the desk drawer and took out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to Holmes. Holmes examined the letter. Plain white paper, typed. Care had been taken to leave no traces. Who else did you share this letter with? No one, but... Mercer hesitated. A week later, I had another visitor, a Russian man, Viktor Zaroff. Holmes and Watson exchanged glances. What did Zaroff want? The papyrus. The papyrus Sir Reginald bought. He asked me to steal it. He offered me a large sum of money in return. What did you say? Pride flashed across Mercer's face. I refused. I'm no thief, Mr. Holmes. My father may have been, but I'm not. Zaroff was furious, made threats. But my men threw him out. Holmes stood up. Mr. Mercer, you've given us very valuable information. One last question. Where were you last night? Mercer smiled. Here, Mr. Holmes. My men are witnesses. I didn't move an inch all night. When they stepped out onto the street, Watson took a deep breath. The story is getting more complicated, Holmes. Sir Reginald's past is much darker than we thought. Holmes nodded. And someone is digging up that past, Watson. The anonymous letters, Zaroff's appearance, the papyrus being put up for sale. None of this is coincidence. Someone is orchestrating this game. But who and why? Holmes fell deep in thought as he walked down the street. I don't know yet, but I do know one thing. The papyrus is not just a map. It's a key that unlocks the door to the past. And Sir Reginald was killed while trying to open that door. Watson took his watch out of his pocket. It's past 3 o'clock. What shall we do now? Holmes thought for a moment. We'll go to Mayfair. It's time to visit Madame Celeste Moreau. Moreau Antiques was tucked away behind an elegant window on one of Mayfair's chic streets. Behind the glass, Egyptian statues, Chinese vases, and medieval weapons were on display. A brass sign above the door announced the shop's name in gold letters. As they entered, a sweet perfume greeted them. The shop was small but tastefully decorated. Artifacts from different civilizations winked at them from every corner. The woman standing behind the counter was one of the most striking beauties Watson had ever seen. She was around 40, with dark hair pulled back, her hazel eyes sparkling with intelligence. The burgundy silk dress she wore emphasized her elegance. Mr. Holmes, the woman said with a slight French accent, I had anticipated your arrival. Holmes raised his eyebrows. Me? Madame Moreau smiled. When news of Sir Reginald's death broke, I knew the greatest detective would come knocking at my door. Please, sit down. They moved to a small room at the back of the shop. Madame Moreau served tea, her movements graceful and deliberate. Holmes got straight to the point. Madame, what was your business relationship with Sir Reginald? The woman raised her cup to her lips. Reginald was an old customer. I sold him many pieces over the years, and sometimes he sold me pieces too. What kind of pieces? All kinds. Egyptian artifacts, Indian jewellery, Roman coins. Reginald had broad tastes. Watson interjected. Do you know about the papyrus? Madame Moreau's eyes flashed for a moment. Ah, yes, the auction in Paris. I was there. Holmes leaned forward with interest. Did you bid? No, I just watched. The competition between Reginald and Zaroff. It was quite entertaining. Do you know Victor Zaroff? Madame Moreau's face hardened. Everyone knows Victor, Mr. Holmes, and the smart ones stay away from him. Why? The woman hesitated for a moment. Victor Zaroff is a dangerous man. He'll do anything to get what he wants. And right now, what he wants is that papyrus. Would he commit murder to get it? Madame Moreau looked Holmes straight in the eye. Yes, Mr. Holmes, he would. Watson asked, Then why are you being so open about it? The woman smiled, but her eyes didn't. Because I'm in danger too, Dr. Watson. Zaroff thinks I have the papyrus. Last night, his men were watching the shop. Holmes frowned. You have the papyrus? No, but Zaroff doesn't know that, and he won't. Madame Moreau stood up and opened a cabinet. She took out a small box. Reginald sent this to me the day before he died. She opened the box. Inside was a small bronze statuette, a female figure with a sun disk on her head. Hathor, said Watson, the golden goddess. No, said Madame Moreau. This is just a copy, made much later. But look at the back. Holmes took the figurine and turned it over. There were small, carved letters. Greek. The goddess holds the key, Holmes read, the exact phrase Professor Webb mentioned. Madame Moreau nodded. Reginald had discovered something. The map on the papyrus was only the beginning. Something else was needed to reach the real treasure. The key. Yes, and that key is inside the golden goddess. Watson looked confused, but the golden goddess disappeared 20 years ago. Madame Moreau smiled. Disappeared, Dr. Watson, or hidden? She turned to Holmes. Mr. Holmes, I'll tell you something. The golden goddess never sank. It's still in London, and Sir Reginald knew where it was. Holmes's eyes lit up. How do you know? Because Reginald met with me a week before he died. He was very excited. I finally found it, Moreau, he said. It's been where I hid it for 20 years. He said no more, but that look, the look of a man about to reveal his greatest secret. Holmes stood up. Madame Moreau, this information is invaluable. But one more question. What would Zaroff do if he got the papyrus? The woman's face became serious. He would find the treasure, Mr. Holmes, and that treasure would rewrite the history books. That's what Zaroff wants. Power, prestige, infinite wealth. He would kill 10 people, 100 people for it. It wouldn't matter. When they stepped outside the shop, evening had fallen. The gas lamps had begun to glow and the streets were filled with shadows. Watson took a deep breath. Holmes, this is much bigger than we thought. Lost treasures, international crime syndicates, 20-year-old secrets. Holmes nodded. And at the heart of it all is one question, Watson. Where is the golden goddess? Sir Reginald knew. Yes, and that's why he was killed. Holmes stopped in the street and looked toward Ashford Manor. The goddess is in the manor, Watson, I'm certain. Sir Reginald had been hiding her there for 20 years, and the killer knew it. Watson looked sceptical. But how do we explain the locked room? Holmes smiled. Ah, Watson, the locked room. To solve this puzzle, we must return to the manor, and this time we'll look behind the walls. In the distance, the Thames River flowed silently through its dark waters, and somewhere the killer was planning his next move. Chapter 4. London's Hidden Face. As midnight approached, Holmes and Watson found themselves in one of London's darkest corners. The narrow streets of Limehouse looked threatening, even in the dim light of the gas lamps. The salty wind from the river carried the smell of rotten fish and opium. Watson checked the pistol under his coat. "Holmes, what business do we have here at this hour?" Holmes walked ahead, his steps determined. "Information, Watson. London's underworld knows everything that isn't visible on the surface, and I have an old friend who knows everything." They turned into a narrow alley. At the end of the street, in front of a half-ruined building, a rusty sign swayed. "Three Anchors Tavern." Muffled voices and drunken laughter came from inside. When Holmes pushed open the door, Watson saw the scene inside. A dim, smoky room. Rough men sitting at wooden tables, dark figures in the corners. They all fell silent for a moment when they saw Holmes, then went back to their business. They went to the bartender, a fat, bald man. He was wiping glasses with a dirty rag. "I'm looking for Blind Billy," said Holmes. The bartender eyed him. "Who's asking?" Holmes took a gold sovereign from his pocket and placed it on the counter. "Sherlock Holmes." The bartender's eyes lit up. He took the money and pointed to the back. "Last room, but be careful. He's not in a good mood today." They passed through the narrow corridor leading to the back room. When they opened the last door, Watson was met with a surprising sight. The room was cleaner and more orderly than expected. In the middle was a large table covered with maps and papers, and behind the table sat an old man. His face was wrinkled, his hair thinning, but his eyes... Watson realized how misleading the nickname Blind Billy was. Those eyes saw everything. "Mr. Holmes," said the old man, his voice cracked but his mind sharp. "The Ashford case, isn't it?" Holmes sat down opposite him. "Well informed as ever, Billy." Blind Billy laughed. "Information is my business, Mr. Holmes, and I'm good at it." He picked up a pipe from the table and lit it. Sir Reginald Ashford, rich, respectable, but with a dark past. All these rumours are circulating on the streets. "What have you heard?" Billy blew out smoke. "A few things. First, Victor Zaroff is in London. He's staying in a warehouse in Whitechapel. He has 5 men with him, all armed and dangerous." Watson took notes. Zaroff's location was now known. Billy continued. "Second, Zaroff is looking for the papyrus. He's having Ashford Manor watched. His men were circling the garden last night." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Last night, after the murder?" "Yes, they were looking for something. They didn't find it." Watson interjected. "They were looking for the papyrus." Billy nodded. "Probably. But here's the interesting thing. Zaroff's men didn't enter the mansion. They just watched from outside. It was as if they were afraid to go in." Holmes thoughtfully put his finger to his lips. "Or someone inside warned them." Billy raised his finger. "That's what I was getting at. Third piece of news, someone from the Ashford family is in contact with Zaroff." Watson looked shocked. "Who?" "I don't know, but one of Zaroff's men received a letter last night. It came from the mansion." Holmes stood up and began pacing the room. "A traitor within. That explains everything." Billy added something else. "Mr. Holmes, there's one more thing. There was strange activity at the port last night. A Russian ship dropped anchor. It's called the Black Eagle, and that ship is Zaroff's private vessel." Watson grew concerned. "Is Zaroff preparing to flee?" Holmes shook his head. "No, Watson, quite the opposite. That ship is not for escape, but for transport. Zaroff plans to take the papyrus to Russia as soon as he finds it." Billy spread a map on the table, a detailed drawing of the port of London. The Black Eagle is anchored here. He pointed to a spot. And Zaroff's warehouse is here. Another point. 10 minutes between them. Holmes studied the map. Billy, could you do me one more favour? Of course, Mr. Holmes. Anything for money. Holmes took a few banknotes out of his pocket. Keep an eye on Zaroff's warehouse. I want to know every move. Who goes in, who comes out, what they're carrying. Billy took the money and counted it. You'll have the information by tomorrow morning. When they left the tavern, Watson took a deep breath. Looks like we won't be sleeping tonight. Holmes smiled. Sleep can wait, Watson. But now we need to go somewhere else. The Diogenes Club. Watson was surprised. Are we visiting Mycroft? At this hour? My brother never sleeps, Watson. At least not mentally. The Diogenes Club was located in the quietest corner of Pall Mall. From the outside, it looked like an ordinary gentleman's club, but in reality, it was one of England's most secret intelligence centres. And the club's most mysterious member was Sherlock Holmes's brother, Mycroft Holmes. The butler standing at the door recognised Holmes and silently ushered him inside. Club rules prohibited talking beyond the entrance hall, but Mycroft's private room was exempt from this rule. Mycroft Holmes was a larger man than his brother, less agile but equally intelligent. He sat in his enormous armchair, a brandy in his hand, waiting for his brother's arrival. "Sherlock," said Mycroft without rising. "I was expecting you. The Ashford case, is it?" Holmes sat down opposite him. "You heard about it too?" Mycroft smiled slightly. "I hear everything, brother. It's my job." Watson sat down on a chair in the corner. He always felt a little uneasy in Mycroft's presence. The man gave the impression he could read a person's entire secrets with a single glance. Holmes got straight to the point. "What do you know about Victor Zaroff?" Mycroft narrowed his eyes. "Zaroff, a dangerous name. Russian aristocracy connected to the Tsarist family. Officially a collector, unofficially a crime lord." "What kind of crimes?" "All kinds. Antique smuggling, theft, blackmail, murder. He has his fingers in every corner of Europe, but nothing can be proven. The man is like a ghost." Watson interjected. "Why doesn't the British government arrest him?" Mycroft laughed bitterly. "Diplomatic immunity, Dr. Watson. Zaroff holds the title of cultural advisor to the Russian embassy. Arresting him would cause an international crisis." Holmes asked thoughtfully, "So what was his connection to Sir Reginald?" Mycroft pulled out a file. "Years ago, their paths crossed in India. In 1874, the theft in Luxor. Zaroff is said to have had a hand in it." "The Golden Goddess?" "Yes. Zaroff wanted the statue, but Sir Reginald outmaneuvered him. They've been feuding ever since." Holmes examined the file. "And now, 20 years later, the papyrus surfaces. Zaroff doesn't want to lose this time." Mycroft shook his head. "But it's bigger than that, Sherlock. The papyrus isn't just a map. It's something the British government is interested in." Watson looked surprised. "The government?" "Egypt is under British control right now, Dr. Watson. If that treasure really exists and is found, it matters greatly whose hands it falls into. England, Russia, or someone else?" Holmes understood. "So this isn't just a murder case. It's an intelligence matter." Mycroft looked serious. "It always has been, brother. Antiques, treasures, lost artifacts. They're not just wealth, they're power, and people will do anything for power." Holmes stood up. "Mycroft, I'm going to ask you something. Keep an eye on Zaroff's movements. If he finds the papyrus and tries to escape..." "You want me to stop him?" "Yes, at least prevent him from leaving London." Mycroft shook his head. "I can't promise I can do it, but I'll do my best." When they left the club, it was almost 2 a.m. Silence reigned in the streets of London. Occasionally, a night watchman's whistle or a distant dog bark could be heard. Watson took a deep breath. Holmes, this is very complicated. Lost treasures, Russian spies, government interests. It's no longer a simple murder, Holmes replied as he walked. No murder is simple, Watson. Behind every death there is a story, a reason, a passion. And in this case, the passion stretches back 20 years. As they turned a corner, Holmes suddenly stopped. Watson stopped too, trying to understand what was happening. "What is it, Holmes?" Holmes whispered his reply. "We're being followed. There are 2 men behind us. They're watching us from the left street." Watson reached for his gun. "What shall we do?" Holmes thought. "Walk quickly. We'll turn into the narrow street on the right. We'll wait there." The 2 walked quickly and turned into the narrow street. The street was dark, with high walls on both sides. Holmes and Watson leaned against the wall and waited. Footsteps approached. 2 men appeared at the mouth of the alley. Their faces were invisible in the darkness, but their guns glinted. "Mr. Holmes," said one of the men with a Russian accent, "Mr. Zaroff wishes to speak with you." Holmes replied calmly, "And I do not wish to speak with Mr. Zaroff." The man laughed. "This is not an invitation. It is an order." Watson drew his pistol. "One more step and I'll shoot." The other man raised his weapon. The tension was at its peak. Holmes intervened. "Calm down, gentlemen. There's no need for bloodshed." He turned to the men. "You can pass a message to Mr. Zaroff. We can meet tomorrow afternoon at 3 o'clock at Ashford Manor. We'll talk there." The Russians looked at each other. Then one of them nodded. "All right, but don't play games, Mr. Holmes. Mr. Zaroff doesn't like games." The men backed away and disappeared into the darkness. Watson took a deep breath. "Holmes, what have you done? Meet Zaroff?" Holmes smiled. "Sometimes, Watson, the best way to know your enemy is to approach him, and I need to find out what Zaroff knows." By the time they returned to Baker Street, it was approaching 4 in the morning. But Holmes had no intention of sleeping. He sat down at his desk and began examining his notes from the previous night. Watson slumped into his chair. "Holmes, you should get a few hours of sleep. Tomorrow will be a difficult day." Holmes did not respond. His eyes were fixed on the papers. After a while, he looked up. "Watson, I've noticed something. Amidst all this complexity, we were overlooking a simple fact." Watson sat up. "What is it?" Holmes picked up a piece of paper from the desk. "Elsie's statement. At 11 o'clock, she heard an argument in the study. Sir Reginald and someone else. You can't do that. And it's too late." "Yes, I remember." "Well, Watson, if the killer was someone from outside, how would they get in? The mansion's doors are locked, the windows are barred. But Elsie heard an argument inside. That means the killer was already inside." Watson's eyes widened. One of the family members. Or someone from the staff. But more importantly, if the killer was inside, why would they need the number of the locked room? Why go to such lengths, Watson thought. To divert suspicion? Holmes shook his head. Exactly. The locked room is a red herring, Watson. The real question isn't how the killer got in. The question is, was the killer already inside, and how did they get out? Holmes stood up and began pacing the room. And that brings us to the secret passages. Harrington mentioned hidden compartments left over from the previous owners. If that's true, Watson finished. The killer could have left the room using the secret passage, leaving the door locked from the inside. Holmes smiled. Now you're thinking, Watson. Tomorrow, we'll find that secret passage. Watson yawned and asked, "What about Zaroff? Won't meeting him be dangerous?" Holmes replied, "Zaroff is dangerous, yes. But he wants information too. And in an exchange of information, both sides can gain something." "Do you trust him?" Holmes laughed. "Never, Watson, but I want to know him. You can't defeat your enemy without knowing him." As the first light of dawn filtered through the window, Watson finally fell asleep. Holmes, however, was still thinking. His mind was trying to piece together the puzzle. On one side, Victor Zaroff and the international antique smuggling ring. On the other, the Ashford family and 20 years of secrets. And in the middle, a missing papyrus, a missing treasure, and a corpse. Holmes walked to the window and watched London wake up. The streets were slowly coming to life. Milkmen, newspaper sellers, workers heading to their jobs. "Sir Reginald," he murmured to himself, "what did you find, and who killed you for it?" The answer had not yet come, but Holmes knew that today he would be one step closer to that answer. At 8 o'clock, a telegram arrived from Blind Billy. Holmes opened the envelope and read it. A smile appeared on his face. "Watson," he called. "Wake up, important news." Watson rubbed his eyes and sat up. "What is it?" Holmes handed him the telegram. "Billy's men watched Zaroff's warehouse. Last night, a visitor came to the warehouse. Guess who?" Watson read the paper. His eyes widened. "Frederick Ashford?" "Yes, my friend, Frederick, the one with gambling debts, the one who needs the inheritance. He met secretly with Zaroff." Watson looked horrified. "So he's the traitor. He sold out his own father?" Holmes replied thoughtfully. "Perhaps, or perhaps he's just a pawn. But now is the time to find out." He picked up his coat. "We're going to Ashford Manor, Watson, and this time we'll lay all our cards on the table." As the clock struck 9, Holmes and Watson set off once more for Hampstead Heath. Behind them lay the rumbling of London, just waking up. But neither of them knew that the events of that day would change the entire course of this case. Chapter 5. Spider's Web. When they arrived at Ashford Manor, the morning sun had painted the leaves of the trees in the garden golden yellow. But this beauty did nothing to ease Watson's unease. Frederick Ashford's secret meeting with Zaroff had put everything in a different perspective. Mr. Harrington greeted them at the door. The old butler's face looked paler than usual. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, we were expecting you. The family is in the breakfast room." Holmes asked, "Is everyone here?" "Yes, sir. No one has left the estate, per Lady Vivian's orders." When they entered the breakfast room, Watson saw the tense faces of the family members. Lady Vivian sat at the head of the table, cold as ever. Frederick stood by the window, hands in his pockets, his face pale. Charlotte sat quietly in a corner, drinking tea. William stood by the door, arms crossed, eyeing Holmes. "Mr. Holmes," said Lady Vivian, her voice as sharp as a blade of ice, "I hope you will bring some answers today. This uncertainty is destroying my family." Holmes walked to the centre of the room. "Lady Ashford, we will indeed find some answers today. But first, I need to ask a few questions." He turned his eyes to Frederick. "Mr. Ashford, where were you last night?" Frederick's face froze for a moment, then he composed himself. "In my room. I was sleeping." "Really?" Holmes pulled a piece of paper from his pocket. "Because according to my sources, last night around 10 o'clock, you were in a warehouse in Whitechapel. You were meeting Victor Zaroff." There was silence in the room. Lady Vivian's eyes widened. Charlotte almost dropped her cup. William leaned forward with interest for the first time. Frederick's face turned bright red. That's a misunderstanding." "Is it?" Holmes moved closer. "Then explain, Mr. Ashford. What business did you have with a Russian crime lord?" Frederick was at a loss for words for a moment, then his shoulders slumped. "All right. Yes, I met with Zaroff. But it's not what you think." Lady Vivian stood up. "Frederick, what does this mean?" Frederick turned to his stepmother. His eyes held both fear and defiance. "I have debts. A lot of debts. Zaroff offered to pay them off," Holmes asked coldly. "What did he want in return?" Frederick swallowed. The papyrus my father bought. He wanted me to give it to him." Watson interjected. "Did you give it to him?" No, Frederick shouted. I couldn't. The papyrus was in my father's study, and my father was dead. I told Zaroff I didn't have it. He didn't believe me. He threatened me. Holmes asked thoughtfully, What kind of threats? Frederick's voice trembled. He said that if I didn't bring the papyrus, he would collect my debts by other means. He implied he could harm my family. Lady Vivian looked at him angrily. You put this family in danger? Charlotte spoke for the first time. Mother, calm down. Now is not the time for accusations. Holmes approached Frederick. Mr. Ashford, I'm going to ask you a very important question, and I expect you to answer honestly. Did you kill your father? Frederick's eyes filled with tears. No, I swear no. My father and I didn't get along, but I would never kill him. He was my father. Holmes studied him for a long time. Then he shook his head. I believe you, Mr. Ashford, but you still have a lot to explain. William spoke from the corner. Mr. Holmes, my brother may be a fool, but he's no murderer. Let me tell you that too. Holmes turned. You have something to say too, Mr. William? William lowered his arms and stepped forward. Yes, I knew Frederick was meeting Zaroff, because I followed him. Lady Vivian held her breath. William. William shrugged. I noticed my brother acting strangely these past few days. He was going out late at night. I was curious and followed him. I saw Zaroff's warehouse but didn't go inside. Holmes asked with interest. Why didn't you say anything? Because I wanted to protect the family name. After my father's death, we couldn't afford another scandal. Watson took notes. William was perhaps a more loyal family member than he appeared. Holmes took a deep breath. All right, now let's move on to another matter. Mr. Harrington. The old butler appeared at the door. Yes, sir? Those secret compartments you mentioned yesterday, the ones in the bookcases, do you know where they are? Harrington hesitated. I don't know exactly, sir, but Sir Reginald once mentioned that the bookcase next to the fireplace was special. Holmes's eyes lit up. Excellent. Watson, come with me. We're going to the study. When they reached the second floor, Holmes quickened his pace. They entered the study. The room was still sealed, but Holmes didn't hesitate to break the seal. Lestrade will understand later, he said with a shrug. The interior of the room was unchanged. Sir Reginald's body had been removed, but everything else was in its place. The books, the antiques, the scattered papers on the desk. Holmes walked over to the bookcase next to the fireplace. He ran his hands along the shelves, pulling out the books one by one to check them. Watson watched him. What are you looking for, Holmes? A mechanism, Watson. A button, a lever, something. Holmes climbed the shelves, examining the top of the bookcase. Then he suddenly stopped. Aha! Did you find it? Holmes pulled out a book, an ordinary-looking leather-bound book. But the book didn't move. It just tilted slightly. And then there was a click. A section of the bookcase silently swung open. Behind it was a dark passageway. Watson whistled in amazement. A secret passage! It really exists. Holmes took a match from his pocket and lit it. He looked into the passageway. A narrow stone corridor stretched downward. The walls were damp and mossy. It looked as if it hadn't been used for years. Come, Watson, let's see where it leads. The two entered the passageway. The corridor was narrow and low, and Watson bumped his head several times. After about 20 meters, the corridor descended a staircase. And finally, they reached another door. Holmes pushed the door. It creaked open, and they found themselves in a large basement. The basement was a vast space. Old torches hung on the walls, and in the middle of the room stood something Watson couldn't believe his eyes. A golden statue, a female figure with a sun disk on her head, about 1 meter tall, made entirely of gold. The golden goddess, Watson whispered. Hathor. Holmes approached the statue. His face showed not triumph, but thoughtfulness. It's been hidden here for 20 years, in the basement of his own home. Watson looked around. The basement was like a secret museum. There were other antiques on the walls: Egyptian tablets, Indian statues, Chinese vases. Sir Reginald's secret collection. Holmes examined the statue carefully. "Watson, look, there's something on the base of the statue." Watson approached. There was a small hollow in the statue's golden base, and in that hollow, a keyhole. "A keyhole," said Watson. "The key around Sir Reginald's neck." Holmes nodded. "Yes, the goddess holds the key. The key opens this statue, and inside, the true secret of the papyrus." Holmes smiled. Perhaps, or perhaps more. He took a small leather pouch from his pocket. From it, he took a familiar key. Watson was astonished. "Sir Reginald's key. How?" "I borrowed it from Lestrade. It was being kept as evidence, but he entrusted it to me for a few hours." Holmes inserted the key into the lock and turned it. There was a click. The base of the statue opened, revealing a small compartment inside. Inside was a folded old parchment, and next to the parchment, a small letter. Holmes took the letter first and opened it. His face changed as he read. First surprise, then understanding. "Watson," he said, his voice serious. "This letter explains everything." "What does it say?" Holmes read the letter. "Dear Reginald, if you are reading this, I am probably dead. But first, you must know the truth. I stole the golden goddess, yes. But I was not alone. I had a partner, and that partner has always watched you from the closest place. Be careful, old friend. The enemy is not where you think, but where you trust. Jonathan Mercer, P.S. The papyrus is real. The treasure is real, but you must pay the price to reach it. Where the sun rises, the shadow falls longest." Watson looked confused. When did Mercer write the letter? And who is the partner? Holmes shook his head thoughtfully. "Mercer must have written it before the ship sank. He hid it inside the statue. Sir Reginald hasn't opened the statue in years, so he must have just seen the letter." "But the partner? When you say the enemy is where you trust..." Holmes narrowed his eyes. "Someone is very close to Sir Reginald, and that person has been keeping a secret for 20 years. Footsteps came from above. Someone was entering the secret passage. Holmes and Watson quietly moved into a corner. They waited in the darkness. The footsteps drew nearer. A shadow entered the basement, and that shadow took on a familiar shape. Mr. Harrington. The old butler stood there with a gas lamp in his hand. When he saw the golden goddess, an expression appeared on his face. Not surprise. Recognition. Holmes stepped out of the darkness. "Good evening, Harrington, or should I call you by your real name?" Harrington turned. The usual expressionless mask was gone from his face. Now there was something else. A cold reckoning. "Mr. Holmes," said the old man, his voice different, harder. "I may have underestimated you." Watson drew his pistol. "Don't move." But Harrington didn't move. He just smiled. "Dr. Watson, you don't need that gun. I'm no threat, at least not right now." Holmes approached. "What is your real name, Harrington? Or should I call you Thomas Blackwell? Second mate on Captain Mercer's ship?" Watson was shocked. "What?" Harrington, no, Blackwell, bowed his head. "Impressive, Mr. Holmes. How did you figure that out?" Holmes replied. "Mercer's letter. The partner he mentioned must have been on the ship, and the phrase, 'the enemy is where you trust,' pointed to someone closest to Sir Reginald. You've served this family for 30 years. But in reality, you were always watching." Blackwell took a deep breath. "Yes, everything is true. I was Jonathan Mercer's partner. We stole the statue together. The plan was to sell it and split the profits. But Sir Reginald outwitted us," Watson asked. The shipwreck? It wasn't an accident, it was sabotage. Sir Reginald sank the ship. Mercer died, the crew died. I survived by chance. I clung to a piece of wood and reached the shore, Holmes asked. And then you planned your revenge? Blackwell nodded. I wanted revenge first, yes. But then I thought, Sir Reginald was rich and powerful. I couldn't attack him directly. So I chose another path. I infiltrated his inner circle. I gained his trust. And I waited. You waited 30 years? Yes. Patience is the greatest weapon, Mr. Holmes. Sir Reginald softened over the years. Guilt consumed him. And finally, he found the papyrus. That papyrus changed everything. Watson interrupted. Did you kill him? A strange expression appeared on Blackwell's face. No, Dr. Watson. I didn't kill Sir Reginald. I'm not stupid enough to do that. Holmes looked skeptical. But you knew about the secret passage. Yes, I did. I discovered it years ago, but I didn't use it on the night of the murder. Because that night, I wasn't in that passage. Someone else was, Watson asked in astonishment. Who? Before Blackwell could answer, a voice came from above. A woman's voice. Enough, Thomas. It's time to stop talking. Everyone looked up. On the stairs, a figure appeared in the light of the gas lamp. Mrs. Whitmore. But she had something in her hand, a small, shiny pistol. Watson raised his gun, but Mrs. Whitmore was quicker. Put your gun down, Dr. Watson, or I'll put a hole in Mr. Holmes's head. Watson hesitated. Holmes shook his head calmly. Watson dropped the gun. Mrs. Whitmore descended the stairs. The serious housekeeper expression was gone from her face. In its place was a cold, calculating look. Mrs. Whitmore, Holmes said calmly. Or should I call you by your real name? Catherine Mercer, Captain Mercer's sister. Watson looked horrified. His sister? Mrs. Whitmore, no, Catherine smiled. Bravo, Mr. Holmes. You finally put all the pieces together. Holmes nodded. You and Blackwell were working together. You both wanted revenge, but in different ways. Catherine pointed her gun at Holmes. Thomas was patient. I wasn't. I waited 20 years. For 20 years I worked in that man's house, cooked his meals, changed his sheets, and every day I remembered my brother's death. Blackwell intervened. Catherine, don't. It shouldn't end this way. Shut up, Thomas, Catherine shouted. You can wait, but I can't. Sir Reginald paid. Now we're taking the papyrus and leaving. Holmes remained calm. Did you poison Sir Reginald, Catherine? Catherine smiled. Yes, it was very easy. A few drops in the evening tea were enough. A special poison I brought from India. A gift from my brother, Watson asked. But the locked room, how did you get out? Catherine pointed to the secret passage. This passage leads not only to the study, but also to the kitchen. After poisoning Sir Reginald, I went down to the kitchen through the passage. In the morning, I continued my work as if nothing had happened. Holmes asked thoughtfully. Well, the key around his neck? Did you put it there? Catherine nodded. Yes. Sir Reginald was about to open the statue. He was going to solve the secret of the papyrus. I had to stop him. I put the key around his neck so that everyone would think it was a locked room mystery, to distract them. But you didn't find the papyrus! Anger flashed across Catherine's face. Sir Reginald had hidden it. It wasn't on his desk that night. I didn't have time to search. Holmes reached into his pocket. If you're looking for the papyrus, here it is. He pulled out the folded parchment. Catherine's eyes lit up. Give it to me. Holmes took a step back. Put the gun down first. Catherine laughed. I'll kill you and take it, Mr. Holmes. The choice is yours. Just then, loud footsteps came from above. And then a familiar voice echoed. Police! Nobody move. Inspector Lestrade and 4 police officers descended the stairs. Guns were pointed at Catherine. Catherine's face fell. For a moment, she seemed to consider running. Then her shoulders slumped, and she dropped the gun. Lestrade took out the handcuffs. "Catherine Whitmore, you are under arrest for the murder of Sir Reginald Ashford." Holmes turned to Lestrade. "Perfect timing, Inspector." Lestrade smiled. "I got your telegram, Mr. Holmes. You said, 'Wait in the basement,' and I waited." Watson looked at Holmes in astonishment. "When did you send the telegram?" Holmes winked. "This morning, Watson. I was certain we would find the secret passage, and when we did, I knew the murderer would be revealed." As Catherine was led away, Blackwell was also handcuffed. The old man looked at Holmes. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice weary, "I didn't commit murder." Holmes shook his head. "I know, Blackwell, but you hid a crime for 20 years, and that is a crime." Blackwell bowed his head and left with the police. When the basement fell silent, Watson took a deep breath. "Holmes, that was incredible." Holmes looked at the golden goddess. "It's not over yet, Watson. We still have to meet Victor Zaroff. And the papyrus matter." He lifted the parchment in his hand. "This shows the way to the treasure of Amenhotep III, and Zaroff wants it." Watson asked, "What are you going to do?" Holmes smiled, but there was weariness in his eyes. "The right thing, Watson, as always." When they went upstairs, the Ashford family had gathered in the great hall. Lady Vivian's face was ashen. Frederick and Charlotte were in shock. William, for the first time, looked truly shaken. Holmes turned to them. "Your father's killer has been caught. Mrs. Whitmore, whose real name is Catherine Mercer. 20 years of revenge." Lady Vivian trembled. "That woman, she lived in our house for years. She cooked our meals, and we knew nothing." Holmes shook his head. "Sometimes the greatest danger is closest to us, Lady Ashford." Charlotte wiped her eyes. "My father, what did he do to be so hated?" Holmes hesitated for a moment. Then he told the truth. "Your father sank a ship years ago. People died. He stole a treasure. These were serious crimes, Charlotte, but no one deserves such an end." Frederick stepped forward. "Mr. Holmes, my meeting with Zaroff. I have harmed this family. I apologize." Holmes looked him over. "Pay your debts, Mr. Ashford, and never gamble again. That will be the best apology." William asked, "What about the papyrus?" Holmes looked at the parchment in his pocket. "It will be delivered to the British Museum. It will be safe there." But Watson saw the look in his friend's eyes. Holmes was planning something, and that plan was not yet complete. The hours were ticking toward the meeting with Zaroff, and Watson sensed that today was not over yet. Chapter 6. The Final Pieces. As the clock approached 2 in the afternoon, Holmes and Watson had returned to Baker Street for a brief respite. Mrs. Hudson had prepared a hot soup and fresh bread, but Holmes didn't even touch the food. His eyes were fixed on the paper on the table. Watson watched his friend as he sipped his soup. "Holmes, this meeting with Zaroff, it's going to be dangerous. The man is a killer." Holmes replied without looking up. "Zaroff doesn't kill directly, Watson. He has others do it. But today will be different. Today, he may have to get his own hands dirty." "What do you mean?" Holmes lifted the parchment. "This parchment is what Zaroff has been searching for all these years. The path to the lost treasure of Amenhotep III. He will kill for it, yes. But first, he will try. He will make an offer. He will threaten. And that will buy us time." Watson asked anxiously, "Are you going to give him the papyrus?" Holmes smiled, but his eyes didn't. "No, Watson, but I'll make him think I am." He got up from the table and walked to the cabinet in the corner. He took a box out of it. When he opened the box, Watson saw various papers, inks, and pens inside. "What is this, Holmes?" "Tools of deception, Watson. Sometimes, to reveal the truth, you must first tell a lie." Holmes sat down at the table and began working. He started making a copy of the papyrus. His movements were quick and skillful. Within 10 minutes, a copy had emerged that was difficult to distinguish from the original. Watson watched in amazement. "I didn't know you had these skills." Holmes shrugged. "I learned various things in my youth, Watson. They all come in handy someday." He picked up the copy and examined it. "It's not perfect, but it will fool Zaroff for a short time." "What's the plan?" Holmes began to explain. "I will meet with Zaroff. I'll show him the papyrus, the fake one. In exchange, I'll demand that Frederick's debts be forgiven and that he leave England." "Will he agree?" "Probably not. But during the negotiations, I'll find out how many men he has, what weapons they have, their escape plans. I'll pass that information on to Mycroft." Watson frowned. "And then?" Holmes fixed his eyes on Watson. "And then, when Zaroff tries to leave London, the British Navy will stop him. Mycroft's men are watching the Black Eagle. Zaroff will be arrested with the fake papyrus in his hand." Watson appreciated the elegance of the plan. But what if Zaroff realizes the deception? Holmes took a deep breath. "Then things get complicated, Watson, so take your pistol with you." At 10 to 3, Holmes and Watson arrived at Ashford Manor. The manor had fallen into an eerie silence after the morning's chaos. Lady Vivian and her children had been taken to another wing. The police had left, the servants had dispersed. Holmes waited in the great hall. Watson stood guard in the adjoining room, behind the half-open door, his gun at the ready. At exactly 3 o'clock, the sound of a car approached from outside. The door opened and 3 men entered. The man in the middle was one of the most frightening figures Watson had ever seen. Victor Zaroff was a large man, broad-shouldered, about 50 years old. His head was shaved, and he had a deep scar on his face. But the most striking feature was his eyes. Ice blue, emotionless, like the eyes of a predatory animal. The 2 men beside him looked like typical bodyguards, big, muscular, and probably armed. Zaroff approached Holmes. A condescending smile appeared on his lips. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his Russian accent thick but his English fluent. "We finally meet face to face. Your reputation preceded you." Holmes rose calmly. "Mr. Zaroff, yours has too." Zaroff laughed, but it was not a cheerful laugh. "I hear you're a straightforward man. I'll be straightforward too. I want the papyrus." "I know. And what do you want in return?" Holmes pointed to a chair. "Sit down, Mr. Zaroff. Let's talk." Zaroff hesitated for a moment, then sat down. His men remained by the door. Holmes began to speak. "Frederick Ashford owes you £5,000. I want you to write off that debt." Zaroff raised his eyebrows. "Are you bargaining for someone else's debt?" "Frederick is a foolish young man, but he's not a murderer. I want to keep him out of this." Zaroff nodded thoughtfully. "Acceptable. Anything else?" "You will leave England, and you will never set foot in this country again." This time Zaroff laughed, a genuine, hearty laugh. "Mr. Holmes, you really are an interesting man. I am an aristocrat under the Tsar's protection. You have no power to expel me from England." Holmes remained calm. "I know about your diplomatic immunity, Mr. Zaroff. But that immunity does not cover murder charges. If your connection to Sir Reginald's death is proven—" Zaroff's eyes hardened. "Be careful, Mr. Holmes. Accusations are dangerous." "So are threats, Mr. Zaroff." The 2 men stared at each other for a moment. The tension in the room was palpable. Watson gripped the handle of his pistol tightly. Finally, Zaroff spoke. "I want to see the papyrus." Holmes took the fake papyrus from his pocket and placed it on the table. Zaroff leaned forward eagerly. He picked up the parchment and began to examine it. Watson held his breath. Would the deception be exposed? Zaroff held the parchment up to the light. He examined the edges. He looked at the hieroglyphics. Minutes passed. Finally, he looked up. There was a strange expression on his face. "This looks real." Holmes didn't move. "Because it is real." Zaroff placed the papyrus on the table. "All right, Mr. Holmes, I accept your terms. Frederick's debt will be forgiven, and I will leave England for a while." Holmes raised his eyebrows. "That easy?" Zaroff smiled. "I'm a pragmatic man. This papyrus is worth far more than £5,000, and there's no point in me staying in England. What I need is now in my possession." He stood up. "I'm taking the papyrus." Holmes hesitated for a moment. Then he nodded. "Take it." Zaroff took the parchment and carefully placed it in his pocket. He walked to the door. Just as he was about to leave, he turned around. "Mr. Holmes, may I say something? You're a clever man, but sometimes cleverness isn't enough. Sometimes strength is needed too." He smiled. "We will meet again one day, and on that day, be prepared." Zaroff and his men left. The sound of the car faded away. Watson entered the room. "Holmes, we gave him the papyrus. Did we really give it to him?" Holmes smiled. "The fake one, Watson. I still have the real papyrus." He showed his pocket. Watson relaxed. "But what if he realizes it's a fake?" "By the time he does, Mycroft's men will be on the scene. Zaroff's ship won't be able to leave the harbour, and the fake papyrus he has won't lead him to any treasure." Watson sat down. "Excellent plan, Holmes, but wasn't it a bit risky?" Holmes walked to the window. Outside, the sun was beginning to set. "Life is risk, Watson. The important thing is to calculate the risks and act at the right moment." That night, when they returned to Baker Street, a telegram was waiting from Mycroft. Holmes opened it and read it. A smile appeared on his face. "What does it say?" asked Watson. Holmes handed him the telegram. "Black Eagle detained in port. Zaroff and his men in custody. Fake papyrus recovered. Zaroff in a state of rage. Good work, brother." M. Watson laughed. "Excellent. Zaroff finally got what he deserved." Holmes shook his head. "Diplomatic immunity will protect him for a while. He'll probably be deported, but at least he'll be out of England, and the papyrus is safe." Watson asked curiously, "What will you do with the papyrus? Will you give it to the British Museum?" Holmes replied thoughtfully, "I'll deliver it to Professor Webb tomorrow. He will preserve and study the papyrus properly. The treasure, if it truly exists, should belong to the scientific community. It shouldn't fall victim to one man's greed." Watson nodded. "And the Ashford family? What about them?" Holmes looked at the fireplace. The flames danced across his face. "The family is shattered, Watson. Sir Reginald's past, his secret crimes, everything has come to light. But perhaps this could be a new beginning. A clean slate. Lady Vivian. She learned her husband's true face. Painful, but perhaps liberating. She no longer has to live in the shadows. Frederick. He's free of his debts. Hopefully this will be a lesson and he'll give up gambling. What his family needs is a man who takes responsibility. Charlotte?" Holmes smiled slightly. "Charlotte is perhaps the least harmed. She can be happy with her painter lover now. Her father's shadow is lifted." "And William?" "William is an interesting young man. He has radical ideas, but his heart is in the right place. Perhaps one day he will use those ideas in a positive way." Watson stood up and walked to the window. Outside, London was shrouded in night. The gas lamps were lit. The streets had quieted. "Holmes," Watson said, his voice thoughtful. "This case was different. It wasn't just a murder. 20 years of revenge, lost treasures, an international conspiracy. Everything was intertwined." Holmes nodded. "Yes, Watson, and that is real life itself. Events never stand alone. Everything is connected. Every action creates a reaction. Sir Reginald made a decision years ago. He sank a ship, stole a treasure, and 20 years later, that decision found him. Watson turned. "Are you talking about karma?" Holmes shrugged. "Karma, justice, fate? Whatever you call it, there is a balance, Watson. Everything has a price. Sir Reginald paid his. Catherine and Blackwell will pay theirs. And Zaroff, he will pay his one day." Watson turned back to his chair. "What will we do tomorrow?" Holmes yawned as he answered. "Tomorrow. First we'll visit Professor Webb. Then we'll go to Scotland Yard and report to Lestrade. And then—" He paused. "Then?" Holmes smiled. "Then, Watson, we'll wait for a new case. Because London never sleeps. And crime never takes a holiday." Watson laughed. "You never change, Holmes." "Change?" Holmes picked up his pipe and lit it. "Change, Watson, is sometimes necessary. But staying true to oneself, that's the hard part." As the night progressed, the two friends sat quietly. The fire crackled in the fireplace. Occasionally, a carriage passed by outside. 221B Baker Street had found peace once more. But Holmes's mind, as always, continued to work. This case was closed, but others would come. They always did, and Sherlock Holmes would always be ready. Chapter 7. The End of the Melody. A week later, in the last days of November, London saw its first snow. The sidewalks of Baker Street were covered with a thin white blanket. The light streaming through the windows made the snowflakes sparkle like millions of tiny diamonds. In flat 221B, early in the morning, Sherlock Holmes was playing his violin. Melodies drifted through the room, sometimes sad, sometimes cheerful, sometimes thought-provoking. Watson sat in his usual chair, reading the morning paper with a cup of tea. "The Ashford case is in the papers," said Watson, turning the page. "Mrs. Whitmore's, that is, Catherine Mercer's, trial is set to begin next month. She'll be tried for murder." Holmes put down his violin. "The jury will convict her, Watson. The evidence is overwhelming." "What about Blackwell?" "Thomas Blackwell will be tried for aiding and abetting and concealing evidence. He'll probably get 5 to 10 years in prison. Considering his age, he could spend the rest of his life behind bars." Watson folded his newspaper. "Do you think justice has been served, Holmes?" Holmes walked to the window and watched the snow fall. "Justice is a complex concept, Watson. Catherine took revenge for her brother's death, but in the process she became a murderer herself. Blackwell lived with hatred and pain for 20 years. Sir Reginald died without confronting the sins of his past. He turned and looked at his friend. Justice? Perhaps, but no one really won." Watson nodded thoughtfully. "What about Zaroff?" Holmes smiled faintly. "I received a telegram from Mycroft yesterday. Zaroff has been deported through diplomatic channels. He's been sent back to Russia. But Mycroft's sources say the Tsar is not very pleased with Zaroff. Failure is not forgiven in the Russian court. So he'll pay the price. In a way, yes, maybe not prison, but exile, loss of reputation, loss of power. For a man like Zaroff, those things are worse than death." Mrs. Hudson knocked on the door and entered. She held a silver tray with several envelopes on it. "The Morning Post, Mr. Holmes," said the old woman. "And there's one letter I'd particularly like to draw your attention to. It's from the British Museum." Holmes took the letters. He opened the museum envelope first. A smile appeared on his face as he read. "From Professor Webb," he said to Watson. "He's begun examining the papyrus." "What does it say?" Holmes read the letter aloud. "Dear Mr. Holmes, thank you once again for delivering the papyrus. My team and I have begun deciphering the hieroglyphics and are making incredible discoveries. The location of Amenhotep III's secret tomb is described in detail on the papyrus. According to the map, the tomb is not in the Valley of the Kings, but in a rocky area near western Thebes. We have contacted the Egyptian Antiquities Authority. An official archaeological excavation will begin next spring. If this tomb is indeed found, history will be rewritten, and this was made possible thanks to you. Sincerely, Professor Marcus Webb. Note: we deciphered the phrase on the papyrus, "Where the sun rises, the shadow falls longest." This indicates that the tomb's entrance faces east, and that in the first light of morning, the shadow points directly to the entrance. A brilliant signaling system. Watson was impressed. So the treasure could be real. Holmes placed the letter on the table. "We'll see, Watson. Archaeology is a patient business, but at least the papyrus is in the right hands." Watson stood up and refilled his teacup. "What's the Ashford family up to? Have you heard from them?" Holmes shook his head. "I received a letter from Lady Vivian yesterday. They've decided to sell the mansion. It holds too many dark memories. They're moving to a smaller house in Kensington." Frederick, it seems, has really learned his lesson. He's realized how difficult it is to get out of gambling debts. He's now focusing on the family business. Lady Vivian wrote that he's matured. Watson smiled. "So people can change." "Sometimes, Watson, sometimes. Pain is the best teacher." "Charlotte?" A warm light appeared in Holmes's eyes. "Charlotte is engaged to her painter boyfriend, Daniel Crawford. Now that she's free from her father's shadow, she started living her own life. She seems happy." "Good news. What about William?" "William," Holmes paused. "William has chosen an interesting path. He dropped out of university and joined the social reform movement. But he's not violent. Peaceful protests, workers' rights, that sort of thing. Lady Vivian is worried, but I think William is on the right track." Watson walked to the window and watched the snowfall. "Holmes, this case, it really affected me. 20 years of secrets, revenge, lost treasures. It was like a novel." Holmes laughed. "Life, Watson, writes stories even the best novelist couldn't imagine. Our job is simply to read and understand them." "And sometimes write," said Watson, looking at his notebook. "I was going to ask if you were going to write about this case." Holmes shrugged. "You write it, Watson, as always. Your pen is far more compelling than my observations." Watson smiled. "Perhaps I'll call it The Forgotten Melody of the Thames. What do you think?" Holmes nodded. "A fine name. Sir Reginald's life truly was like a melody, one that began brightly, grew dark, and finally cut short." Silence fell. The fire crackled in the fireplace. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Baker Street enjoyed a peaceful afternoon. Suddenly there was another knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson poked her head in. "Mr. Holmes, you have a visitor, a woman. She refused to give her name, but says it's very urgent." Holmes and Watson exchanged glances. Holmes nodded. "Send her in, Mrs. Hudson." The door opened and an elegantly dressed woman entered. She was in her 30s, dark-haired, strikingly beautiful. Her face was half covered by a veil, but her eyes were visible, and there was fear in those eyes. "Mr. Holmes," the woman said, her voice trembling, "I need your help. My life is in danger." Holmes did not rise from his chair. He studied the woman. "Sit down, madam, and start at the beginning." The woman sat down in the opposite chair. She lifted her veil. Watson noticed that she was truly beautiful, but beneath that beauty lay a deep weariness, perhaps even fear. "My name," the woman said hesitantly, "is Isabella Thornwood, and my husband is trying to kill me." Holmes's eyes lit up. A new case, a new puzzle. His mind had already begun to work, but that's another story. As Watson closed the final page of the Ashford case, he felt a new page opening. Crime never slept in London, and Sherlock Holmes was always ready. That night, Watson wrote his final notes in his diary. The Ashford case went down in history as one of the most complex cases of my career. What began as a locked-room murder investigation uncovered 20-year-old secrets, lost treasures, and international conspiracies. Sir Reginald Ashford died without confronting the sins of his past. But his death brought many truths to light. Catherine Mercer and Thomas Blackwell will pay the price for their revenge. Victor Zaroff became a victim of his own ambition, and the Ashford family, though in pain, found a chance for a new beginning. The papyrus is safely kept in Professor Webb's hands. Perhaps one day the treasure of Amenhotep III will be found, or perhaps it will remain lost forever. But at least this ancient secret is in the right hands. As for Holmes, he is, as ever. One case closed, another opened. I don't yet know what Isabella Thornwood's story will bring, but with Holmes by my side, I'm ready for any adventure. The Thames flows silently tonight, but its waters have carried many secrets, many stories, and they will continue to do so. Melodies end, but music never dies. Dr. John H. Watson, Baker Street, London, November 1895. The snowfall continued throughout the night. By morning, London was covered in a blanket of white. At 291B Baker Street, the lights were still on. Holmes and Watson were discussing the details of a new case. Somewhere, deep within the British Museum, an ancient papyrus guarded its 1,000-year-old secrets. Perhaps one day, these secrets would be solved. Perhaps never, and the Thames River flowed silently, as always, carrying the melodies of the past, the hopes of the future, the stories of the present, like the heart of London ceaselessly, tirelessly, forever. Some melodies are forgotten, others echo forever. This was one of the latter. The end